Good afternoon and welcome to the University of Miami Global Academy's live stream session. We're delighted that you joined us today. My name is Teresa Salafrio and I'm the Academic Director here at the Global Academy. And this week is Teen Read Week, and so students from all over the country are celebrating Teen Read Week in different ways. And so what we've decided to do today is invite someone in to talk to all of you. Our students especially who are joining us in the chat room, and someone who's going to share her thoughts and ideas on reading and writing. And so without further ado, I will go ahead and introduce everyone in the chat room. With us today we have two of our students. We have Rachel Gastaldo and Jonathan Papica. Thank you so much for joining us. And we also have Miss Karen Panarelli, who is our lead language arts teacher. And our special guest with us here today is Evelina Galang. And I'm just going to read you a little bit about her. She has been named one of the most influential Filipinas in the United States. She is the author of the story collection Her Wild American Self, which we have with us today, the novel One Tribe, and the editor of the anthology Screaming Monkeys. She's the recipient of numerous awards, including the 2004 Gustavus Myers Outstanding Book Awards, Advancing Human Rights, and the 2004 AWP Prize in the Novel. Evelina Galang also directs the MFA Creative Writing Program here at the University of Miami. And so we thank you so much for joining us and welcome you to our session.
Thank you for having me.
All right, and so I know that Rachel and Jonathan, you had some general questions before we actually get into the book, some general questions. So Rachel, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
How did you discover your love for reading and writing? What inspired you?
I think I started reading as early as, I want to say, the first time I learned the alphabet, like kindergarten, even before then. When I first started reading, I was a total bookworm, and oftentimes I tell kids or tell people that my favorite book of all time is Ramona the Pest. I don't know if you know. I mean, before it was ever made into a movie, and the first line is, "I am not a pest, I'm not, I'm not, I'm not." So I've been a reader my whole life, and I've come from a family that's big and noisy, so I turned to reading and I turned to writing to kind of find my own space.
Great question. Jonathan?
How do you generate ideas for your books?
Well, what I tell my writing students is I tell them to try to find things that matter to them, questions that they have where they don't have the answers. And oftentimes when we're kind of confused or feeling unsure of the way things turn out, that's a great place to begin for story. So for me, even as a teenager, I would go into my diary. I had a diary that every night I would pour everything into. I have 4 brothers. I'm the oldest of 6 kids, so I have 4 brothers who used to really make me crazy. So, I would begin with all those kind of feelings of like how to control them, and like why is it this way in this house? What about girls? Why do boys have it different than girls? So, that's where I began. I began my stories from the inside with things I don't understand. So. The story collection really begins in that place where I was looking at growing up as a Filipina American in the United States, as a Filipina in America, and trying to figure out identity and boundaries and things like that. So starting from things I don't understand, I think those are where stories come from.
Rachel, another question?
Do you have any advice for student writers?
Right.
Right.
That's it. Oh, I can't swear, can I? Sit your you-know-what down and write. That's what I say. I mean, it's so funny because people will come and they'll ask for all kinds of, tips and this and that, and all you really need to do is just sit down, open up the book, and just start writing. And once you start writing and you go into that zone, you can find all kinds of ideas and all kinds of things that you didn't know that you had to say. You know, I like to think there was once a composition writer, teacher who said, you know, we write to discover what we have to say. That was Donald Murray. And I think that's very true. You know, you just kind of sit down and you do it, and then you find out you've got ideas and stories to tell. So my advice is to sit your you-know-what down and just do it.
Great. Jonathan?
What's the best way for students to interpret the author's style and purpose?
Well, I think you have to come, all readers come with their own luggage, their own baggage, and their own way of seeing things. And the characters, for example, in this story, all have their own perspective as well. Some of them I share, some of them I don't. And I think that all readers just have to come to it with an open mind and a sincere heart, and also engage their own stuff, their own issues with the material. And I think that's the best way to approach the material. That's great. Good stuff.
So I guess we'll move on to talking specifically about your story collection, because we're kind of excited. We all had a chance to read the excerpt, and I know a lot of our students in the chat room did as well. And this is a story collection where I think you mentioned a lot of different characters are coming into play with different experiences. I know we are going to have you talk a little bit about it and share a piece.
Yeah, I think I'll start by just reading the opening for her. I think you guys read Lectures You Never Learned at Home, right?
Yes, we did. Yeah.
So that's a really good one. I know that we're talking to high school students and teens, and this really was the story collection is, it's all fiction, but you know, fiction is, I am always quoting my teachers. One of my teachers used to say that good fiction is a fine balance between memory and the imagination. So a lot of the pieces are born of experiences I've had or witnessed and things that I've seen, but there are 3 pieces throughout this book that begin and middle and at the end that are nonfiction. You know, they're born of my actual rantings. So that's actually what Lectures on How You Never Lived Back Home is. It's a little rant about all the voices that you hear when you're in a house and you're listening to all the grown-ups around you. Lectures on How You Never Lived Back Home. You grew up hearing 2 languages. One you can pull apart, name, slap a series of rules to, twist like Play-Doh in a child's hand. The other you cannot explain. You listen and you know. It is a language you understand intuitively, like being able to read the sunrise, the strips of pink and orange, the clumps of uneven clouds, a thin patch of gray and the moon, and somehow, without thinking twice, you know what kind of day it will be. You understand like this because you are the firstborn, first generation, first American, first cousin, first hope. Back home, one of your grandmothers sewed children's clothing by hand and sold them in an open-air market. The other grandmother raised 7 children on her own, gathering them up, hiding them away in the provinces along the sea, away from Japanese soldiers, away from American fighters, away from war. Your grandmother feared the safety of all her children, especially her young ladies. Your mother survived wartime. She was smart and well-read and ambitious, skipped grades, traveled across the oceans, met your father in Milwaukee, and gave up her princess status to be your mother. As a boy, your dad farmed fish out of monsoon-swollen rice paddies, cut school to hitchhike from Pampanga to Rizal just to see MacArthur. Somewhere in his youth, he spied on American GIs and caught on to this notion of democracy, this notion of rights, his family's rights, the rights of his countrymen, the rights taken first by 300 years of Spanish rule, then Japanese terror and war, then of course there were the Americans and their intentions. After sneaking about soldier camps, making friends with a GI from Atlanta, bumming cigarettes from another from Pasadena, your father worked his way out of those provinces, studied hard at school. He passed his boards, passed immigration, slipped into that ballroom on Racine and Wisconsin, and charmed his way into your mother's life. They raised you to understand that back home, a young girl serves her parents, lives to please them. fetches her father's slippers and her mother's cups of tea. Back home, a young girl learns to embroider fine stitches, learns parlor dances, wears white uniforms at all-girls schools, convent schools. She never crosses her legs or wears skirts above the knee. Back home, a girl does not date. She is courted. And when there is a young man present, there is always a chaperone. Young ladies grow up to be young housewives, good mothers, and in their old age, they still behave like obedient daughters. So I know you have the rest of it, but I thought that would be a good way to open up the discussion. So when I started writing, seriously writing, I went into this summer workshop. I was working in the film business in Chicago, and I took a summer workshop in upstate New York, and I turned in a 40-page story, single-spaced, to my workshop leader about like these white girls in Wisconsin. And my teacher like pulled me aside. I think she was pregnant too. I don't think I helped her with the pregnancy. So she pulled me aside and she said, first of all, 40 pages single space is too much. And then she said, and I don't understand why you're not writing about the things that you know. I mean, I know white girls in Wisconsin. They were my classmates, and I knew them from like watching them, but I didn't know them from the inside out. And I think that's what she was talking about. She said, why don't you, so she said to me, if you're really serious, because I think she said, I think you have something to say. I don't think you know what it is. So she said, why don't you write a short story, a 10-page story, and take the things that you know, the details in your life, and start there and see what you've got. Because you were asking, where do your stories come from? So I did that, and I guess the first story that I really wrote about, which is in here, is called Our Fathers, and it was about this time when I remember my grandfather. We were waiting and waiting. My mom and dad are from the Philippines, and they were saving money to bring my grandparents over, and they were also waiting for the visa and all that kind of stuff. And just as they had saved up the money to bring my grandparents over, they got a phone call in the middle of the night, and my grandfather had passed away. And it was the first time that I remember seeing my father break down like a child. He lost his daddy. And so I remember my two younger brothers and I sitting there on the stairs just watching him crying, crying the night through, and just really just the regret of not being able to show his father everything that he had achieved. So that was really the beginning of the first story that I ever wrote, because it was such a vivid memory for me. And then it actually got me into graduate school. And so I did my graduate work at Colorado State, and there I started just to write stories that I didn't think were connected. I kept thinking these are different stories about different girls. They all happened to be Filipino American. They all happened to be born, in the United States. But they were at different ages. Some of them were teenagers. Some of them were working women. Some of them were corporate, that kind of thing. Some of them were artists. But I thought, they're all different. But really, in the end, what I found as I was revising is it was all about learning to be who you are, and identity, like learning how to balance what it means to be coming from a culture which is an immigrant family, which I know many of us in Miami we come from. Like, Miami is the best international city ever. I don't know if you ever talk about that in your conversations, but we're from all over, but then we're also Americans. And when you're a teenager, it's hard to figure out how to balance, what do you take from home and what do you take from your American culture, right? And how do you become the person that you are? So I think that's what the stories are about in Her Wild American Self. They're about claiming your identity. I don't know. Maybe that opens up questions for everybody.
Yes. Yeah. Do we have any questions in the chat room? Not yet? Okay. While we're waiting for some questions to come in from the chat room, do you maybe want to talk a little bit about, because I see you have your other... I have
the novel, yeah. Well, so what happened when this book came out? It was Her Wild American Self came out. It was the first book that was published about the American-born Filipino experience. And so I had a lot of young people writing to me letters, like teenagers, and they were reading the book in junior high and things like that. So I started to hear about all these experiences of youth and teen gangs and things like that, and I got really interested in their stories, and also at the thought that this is the first time they were having their stories mirrored back to them. So one tribe is actually born of some of the stories that I heard from my students and from other young people in Virginia Beach. So I'm just going to read to you. There was this, when I was living in Virginia Beach, there were a lot of youth gangs, and they weren't even like youth gangs like really tough youth gangs. They were like youth gangs looking for their own identity, you know, and just trying to find a space and a place of their own. So I'm just going to read a very short piece while we wait for questions from one tribe. And all you really need to know is that these are teenagers who are teenage girls, and that dalagas means, it's like the Filipino word for when you're no longer a girl, but you're not quite a woman yet. She's tweens, right?
Right.
So here we go. Las Dalagas swam undersea because they figured that was one place no one could find them. Down there was too deep for their moms and their pops. They'd never bother to look below the coral reefs, to seek them mingling with the starfish, hot flashes of glitter light twinkling in the Black Sea. LDs knew that in the Philippines, nobody swam past the shallow end. You get too dark if you stay out that long. Their moms and pops would wade as far as their knees, maybe their armpits, but they'd never venture farther than that. So the mermaid girls shot their fine finned bodies deep into the bottomless sea, floated effortlessly far away. Life on land was painful, like someone setting fire to skin, or carving beauty along a stretch of the back, or ramming a truck right into your bones. If LDs could survive that kind of pain, they knew they could be sisters for life. So they went through it all together, even tested one another, and then they let it go at the deepest end of the sea. They swam at midnight, water ballerinas in an Esther Williams movie, holding hands underwater, blowing bubbles at each other, sprouting up like a chorus of silver flying fish. Sometimes they sang at the top of their lungs, "So we come to the end of the road." And they held each other up, their limbs floating to the surface like ocean fairies, and I can't let go. The night sky absorbed the pain, and sea salt calmed them little by little. Only the strongest girl could be a dalaga, a deep swimmer, a tropical finned lady, a sister. Today, they were recording their victories. They waited against the rocks as Maya held the camera up and shot them one by one. Angel posed with her arms up above her head, her face turned away and away from the lens. The t-shirt rising up at her back revealed a terrain of muscles, and just left of the spine, below the hip-hugger jeans, the Ali Bata ideograph for Pinay, dancing there, rippling like a mirage in the middle of a brown desert. Maya zoomed in, clicked. She shot a medium close-up of Ria's left arm, and the array of scratches rising up from her smooth skin. Her body overhealed, bumpy, marred, and discolored. It was a sort of braille. Next, Maya zoomed in on Marilena's right eye at the corner where the knife nicked her, tore a little flesh right off her. The cut was not so deep, but so close to the eye, and it bled fast and furious, made her think she had gone blind. Now the heavy liner and the shadows, the lavender, the pink, and the magenta powders made the scar a wild, exotic flower. "Shut your eye," Maya told her. And when Marilena's lashes fell against her skin like thick black petals, Maya captured the frame. Maya clicked, rewound, clicked, moved closer with each sister, caught the movement of skin as they held themselves in the light. Beyond them, the pelicans charged the ocean floor for fish. When she focused on the scars, on the eruption of skin, disfigured forever, memories of the nights her sisters were jumped, usurped the lens, came back in flashes. She could hear the sisters screaming, and it was loud, vibrating as the cry ricocheted inside her like a bullet. "Don't be scared," she whispered, peeling the fabric of Mercedes' shirt open. She focused on Mercedes' right breast, not the whole breast, just the crest that peeked over the top of her miracle bra. The sun cast a shadow on the valley that sloped up and over the top of the fabric. The breast, a golden globe of brown skin, was perfect save for the wound. The stitches haunted the flesh, faint as ghosts. When Maya got to Lourdes, the beauty queen spread her thighs apart and revealed teeth marks, a circle of little mountains rising just above the knee. The lens picked up the crisscross texture of the skin around the mark, the fine pores, the depth of the scar, a little uneven, a little off. They chose to be mermaids and not fish girls because there was that other part of them that wanted to be on land. Beautiful girls with fat boyfriends and families they would die for. As much as they hated the world, they could not forget their peeps. They were brown girls, Pinai, one of the tribe. Ocean life 24/7 meant they'd be alone forever. And I can't let go. They'd sing to each other in the deepest part of the bay, their arms wide open to the sky, ready to embrace anything. The circle of teeth buried in Lourdes' skin was so dark and so deep that Maya felt like running her fingers along the rim of those teeth, erasing them with a dabble of spit. Is this worth it, she wondered. Is this cool as all that? She was losing faith. Maya handed the camera to Lourdes, and facing the sun, she wiped the tears that had begun to blur her vision. What are you crying for? Lourdes said. You should be proud. Yeah, Angel said, this is going to be hella cool. That's right, Rhea said. Las Dalagas, forever. Lourdes zoomed in and said, I see the red in your eyes. Do you want that to show? Doesn't matter. Just make sure it's in focus. Lourdes squinted into the viewfinder, searching Maya's face. She trembled, and Maya saw understanding color Lourdes' cheeks. Lourdes could see what Maya knew. It was all bullshit. The beatings, the tattoos, the swimming with the fishes. Hold your breath, Maya told her, and focus. Lourdes darted the camera around, tracked the grooves that ran the length of Maya's face, 4 scabs, long and thick, brown as mud, running parallel to one another, even as rows in a field of rice. Clouds floated across the sky and hid the bright sun, made the air feel cool as rain.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Welcome.
And I see we have a question or questions from the chat room.
We've had a few come in. One is from Alana Chow, who asked, do you feel that this young woman's experience is still the norm for first-generation Filipinos?
I think that there's maybe a variation of that as all things change and grow. I think that, with the times being different than when I was a teenager, I think that there are certain things, the Filipino experience, we're a very family-centered community, very faithful and spiritual community. We're mostly Catholic, and we have a tendency to feed one another. Good cooks. So there are certain things about the family that stay with us, So there is, I think so. I think that there are experiences that are going to be a little bit different than growing up in the 70s and having Farrah Fawcett haircuts. But I do think that there is that fine balance of trying to separate from family and being yourself.
The next question comes from Simone, saying, coming from another culture myself, I can identify with the struggles and confusion of your heroine. Do you think that by addressing the Filipino culture, you simultaneously address the concerns and sometimes pain of other cultures, meaning being far from home?
I hope so. I think that that writers oftentimes start from the particular. From what we know, like I was saying earlier, right, that my teacher was saying, why are you writing about white girls? You only know them from the outside, but you start from the particular, and ultimately we're all human, and we all have very similar desires and issues and needs, and so when you begin in that particular space of what you know, you begin to talk to a broader community, and you begin to talk about the human experience. So I would hope that, that's one of the things that makes me really happy if people from other cultures can relate. Yeah. Thank you, Simone. That was Simone, right?
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
The next question comes back to Alana, asking, do Filipino men experience the same struggle? What challenges would they face in reconciling their ancestry with their modern lives?
Ooh, that's a very good and deep question. Well, until the day when all men and women are absolutely equal in all ways, I would think, I think they face similar struggles, but they're their own struggles. They're the struggles that men go through, and that men of color go through, and specifically Filipino men. And what was that was a two-part question, right?
What challenges would they face in reconciling their ancestry with their modern lives?
Yeah. I would really love to see those brothers of mine in the kitchen a little more often than they are. But no. Some of them are in the kitchen, so I don't want to. Right. There are men. There are. Wow. Some of the challenges. I think some of the challenges have to do with really listening to one another. Both the men and the women in the culture, and hearing what our needs are, and being able to find ways to compromise. I think for not just Filipino men, but like all men, right. All women, right? Mm-hmm. So, would that I could speak for the Filipino man, but I cannot.
Okay, the next question comes from the UMGA math teacher. Saying, you stated that because you were meant for the better life, whatever that is. Okay, and the question is, do you think this young lady found her version of a better life than what her parents had?
Yes. Yes. Oh, yes. I mean, I think because in that piece, gosh, I'm going to turn my back to it. If you take a look at the end there, I've got to put my reading glasses. That's what happens when you get older. The shape of your eye changes, and you can't read anything without lenses. Otherwise, I'm sure you'd think I was like 15. But if you take a look at the end of the piece that you guys read. Because all your life you've been simply told, just told, because of a council of ancestors, including a few who are not yet dead, who are not even related to you, haunt you. You do your best. You try, you struggle, and somehow, and this is where I think that she's going to find that better life, when you stand in the center of the room and the others look on, you find yourself acting out your role, smart American girl, beautiful Filipina, dutiful daughter. So in some ways she's doing what she's being asked to do, and yet she's actually, this piece is in the middle of the book, so she's struggling here. She hasn't come to the understanding that in the end it's like the three pieces. The first piece, the look-alike women in the book, is about the way the universe kind of sees Asian American women, and how they kind of put us all in the same pot, and they see everybody as the same, and that kind of voice that women are hearing tends to affect their self-esteem and their issues. In this piece, Lectures You Never Learned Back Home, she's hearing all the voices of the family, and she's still struggling. She hasn't quite made it out. By the end of the book, the piece is from her perspective, and I think here, this is really funny because you're going to laugh, but I think it's called Mixed Like Stir Fry. That's what it's now called. But originally it was called Ultimately Just Another Cheesehead, because I'm from Wisconsin, right? But it's really about, in the end, it's really about finding your place on this earth, and learning how to balance that. So, see, it's still yes.
The next question comes from the UMGA science teacher. It says, at the end of the passage, when the young woman is acting out the role, does the use of the word role imply she does not really see herself as smart, beautiful, American, and Filipina?
I think it's, no. I think, maybe in part. But I think what it is she's living up to her expectations, that even though she thinks she's struggling and she thinks that she can't handle it, she, in fact, is rising above it. So.
It was a two-parter, and then it also asked, is she putting on a mask over who she really is?
she's in the middle of a struggle. So no, it's like the mask is falling off, in fact.
And then the last question we have so far is from Stone, saying this doesn't have to do with the story, but what were the thoughts and emotions that you had when you were writing the book?
Well, a lot of times it was, I need to get my work done for a class, right? I need to get it in there. But for me, it was, it was such an exciting time. This is my first book, Her Wild American Self, and I was doing it when I was in graduate school. And I actually had been working for 7 years in the film business before going back to graduate school and actually pursuing what I consider my dream. So it was such a heavenly place to be able to sit at my computer in my pajamas all weekend long and to immerse myself into the world of these characters, and to finally find a voice that was my voice. It's fiction, but I said there's always like a fine balance of the imagination and of reality, the truth. So that was pretty exciting, and then to see that the book had a life apart from me, that it leaves the confines of my little computer in my little office, and it has relationships with other young readers, and actually some of my readers have their mothers read the book, mothers and fathers, so that they start to understand where they're coming from. So never imagined that would happen, because it was just about me trying to fulfill my own dream.
Well, we did have another question that came in from Alana Chow again, asking, do you write more for yourself, your readers, or for both equally?
It starts from myself. It starts from a drive. It starts from, you mentioned that I direct the creative writing program. It's like I've got a day job, and if I'm not writing, then it's like I'm not really being who I am, right? And so then it's like all these feelings and words and ideas and things are being kind of stifled in a way. They're being held. They're being held, and they're like, I'm ready to burst. So so it begins there. And then, of course, because I'm trying to communicate to someone, it's about that relationship with the readers, because I always say to my students, if they're like, but I wanted it to be that way, and and I don't really care. But if you don't really care, that's what your diaries are for, that's what your journals are for. But if you're writing stories for people to read, then people need to be able to connect to them. So very much for my readers as well.
And that's it so far.
Okay. I have a question. When you sit down to write, because you're writing about, like you said, things that you know or things from your experience or questions that you have, does it typically come easy, and does it just flow? Or, we often hear of writer's cramp and...
Right. I like that, writer's cramp. Exactly. I don't really think there's such a thing as that, writer's block. I think there's such a thing as sometimes we're afraid to confront our own fears, like when you want something so badly, and then you get to that scary place where you have to confront it, and you go, I don't really want it so badly, I don't really want to try.
I'm not so sure anymore.
Yeah, and I think that's what that's about. But I think that I just read a book of a very good friend of mine. It just came out, and it was his book of memoir. And I find, he confronted a lot of his demons and things that are kind of embarrassing to have to confront to yourself, which is hard enough to do day to day, but then to write about it and then to open yourself up to the entire world, I think is a very courageous act. And he says, well, I don't see that as courage. I see that as me trying to understand myself and trying to figure my own self out. And I think people have a hard time doing that on their own. People who aren't writing have a hard time doing that on their own. So I do think it's an act of courage. If you give me time to write, I find ways of doing it. And sometimes I don't feel like doing it, right? But it's the only time I have. So I actually, if you come to my office, when my students talk about writer's cramp, I'll open up my cabinet behind me and I'll say, look at this. And there's like all these journals, huge journals and binders, different versions of one tribe, but different journals. And every time I get stuck, I pull out a journal and I trick myself. I write about like how I can't write about this today, like I have a very difficult passage that I'm working on and I can't believe I'm having a hard time getting into it, and I kind of talk to myself in that journal, and then in doing that I eventually, oftentimes will start writing what I'm having a hard time writing. So I just sit my you-know-what down and I do it, you know. But it's a way, you gotta, you know, I always say, you have to know what your organizing principle is, and then you need to, and your strengths and your weaknesses, like how you work, and then you create your writing habits from there. You know, if you know that you're the kind of person that needs to work late at night, then do it late at night. Or if you can't sit still and you have to do little bits and pieces, then organize your writing life that way. But don't fight against your nature.
I have a quick question.
Mhm.
As a writer, do you find yourself, because I think we all grew up like where we were writing, handwriting,
Yes.
and in journals with
Sure.
paper before like it became so common to always be typing everything on the computer. Do you still find yourself as a writer? Do you only type your ideas on a computer, or do you still do
No, I do
journal
both.
writing?
No, I do both.
Handwriting.
Right. It really depends on what's happening in terms of the process of the book, where I am. If I'm drafting, if I'm revising, if I'm brainstorming. Sometimes I'll go to paper. Sometimes I'll go straight to the computer. Sometimes I have an iPhone 4 now, so sometimes there's that. So I use whatever is available in the moment, and but I think that kids are still growing up writing.
Yes, I think
By hand. Because just yesterday, I'm going to brag a little bit, my 9-year-old niece, Julia, my brother sent me Julia's writing that she did. Her teacher, she's in 4th grade, she's 9. Is that 4th grade? Yeah. And the writing prompt was, what would you do if you were the teacher and everybody forgot their homework? Which leads me to believe that everybody forgot their homework. So what Julia did was, and it was great, because he took a picture of it and sent it to me. It was on loose leaf paper and in her handwriting, her big old handwriting, and she wrote a scene. She wrote a scene where she said, "What? You did not remember your homework?" And then and she calls herself Miss G. She's the teacher, Miss G, and she reprimands the kids, and it's a whole scene, and her eyes go wide, and then the children's eyes go to their feet, it's great. It's a little story with a little tension, and she yelled at those kids.
I think we have another question from the chat room.
Yes, our math teacher is asking, from your experience, can you discern any cultural differences between the concepts of protagonist versus antagonist?
Cultural
differences.
Cultural differences.
in that piece, I think, right?
Yeah, I'm assuming so.
Maybe
Ask it again, please.
It says in general.
In general, cultural differences. Well, no, I would imagine that, telling a story is telling a story, and no matter what the story is, you're going to have a protagonist, and the antagonist is a very helpful person to have in the story, because oftentimes we have conversations in my own writing workshops with my students, and it seems to be the hardest thing of all is to find out what the conflict in the story is, Without conflict, there is no story, right? Without drama, there is no story. So the antagonist is oftentimes a very, very helpful person to have because they help to draw what is internal out into the external. There's an actual way of dealing with issues. So it's not enough, for example, in lectures you learn back home for the narrator's voice, the narrator to be going through all these things. She wouldn't be going through this turmoil, this struggle, if there weren't voices coming at her, which is why it's written in second person. I don't know if that answers the question.
I'll speak up in case they elaborate.
Okay.
What can you tell us about the revising and editing process? Because I know sometimes students, certainly not Rachel and Jonathan,
No.
but, you know, they like to submit their first copy of things,
Yes.
you know, what they sit down and do and then submit.
I am the revision queen. I'm all about revision. Revision, revision. So like re-seeing a
Yes.
piece, right? It's really important, I think, to do your homework early so that you can put it away. So you can put it away and get some space from the time that you've actually written a piece, and when you take a look at it again. Because if you go, of course, if you go to revise something that's fresh off the press, you don't see the issues that a piece might have because you're still sort of in love with what you've done, and you know you're in that moment. But when you put it away and you come back, many of us know the feeling of, oh my God, what was I thinking? or you know what, this is still pretty good. Or, oh, you know what, this section is really good, but I'm still kind of weak over here. Or, you know, I'm missing an element here. And so I think it's really important to be able to give yourself space and time and permission to turn something around and turn it upside down. Like I have students that will say to me, if I do that, I'm going to change the whole thing. And I'm like, yeah, excellent.
That's okay.
You know, that's what
Right.
you want. You want to be able to, you know, give yourself permission to make it the best thing that you've ever done. And you can only do that if you're willing to change everything, if that's what it's going to take. I'm a big proponent of, you know, cutting big pieces out and putting new pieces in. And I do an exercise with my students where I have them cut their stories up into I call them story events, because sometimes it's exposition and sometimes it's scene, right? But they're all events, they're all story events. And I say cut them up. And you guys might want to think about doing this, and you take a piece and you cut it up and then you exchange it with somebody.
Yeah.
And then you have them puzzle it together. And guess what? Maybe they'll be fine. It's like putting that bike together that you've taken apart, and you've got like an extra, like, oh look, I have an extra piece here, you know. And maybe that's because that scene or that story event wasn't necessary. And sometimes there'll be, I say, feel free to put a white piece of paper there where you see a gap where something's missing, because then you know there's a scene or something that needs to be written there. So I'm all for it. My teachers hated me because, I mean, really, like Stephen, my teacher, used to say, you know, I give you notes, and like the next day you've got another revision, and it's really different, you know, because that's where the art comes in. You know, that's the other thing I say. The first draft is expression. That's expression. That's what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to say this. And then it's in the revision that you create the art.
Do you hear that, students out there?
Yeah, art comes afterwards.
Yes,
Art comes
good.
with the thought and the strategy of, you know, how do I make this the best thing I can make it?
That's great, because it's so true. A lot of students they're so busy with all their classes, and so they want to express themselves, they want to do the assignment, but then they find themselves in that situation of maybe not having the time to go to the next step. But that's where you can really get.
That's really where it's
done.
fun. That's
Yeah.
really where it's fun, because now you're really like you're making something up now, you know. And that's fun. I think it's fun. I'm a geek.
I have one quick question, because I'm all, of course, into this too as an English teacher. This whole idea of this nonfiction versus fiction and the line being blurry. It's just fascinating to think then how do you determine when you're going about this? Is this going to be fiction? Is this going to be nonfiction? I mean, could this be a nonfiction like a memoir piece, or am I going to go the route of using characters to tell my story?
So in part that's intuitive. But like, for example, the work that I'm working on right now, I've been researching the lives of surviving comfort women for the past 15, 20 years. And comfort women, if you don't know, were these women and girls that were taken hostage during World War II by the Japanese Imperial Army and put into sex slave camps. And they were as young as 8 years old as like, 52, and then they would be raped like several times a day, like 15, 20 times a day. So I've been researching their lives, and I actually am writing a book of about 14 of the, well, not actually 15 of the women that I got to meet. They're like now in their 90s, if they're still alive, and many of them have passed away. But I've been really getting to know them and getting to know their stories. And I've been going to the Philippines and doing research there. And even though what I'm trying to do is write a book of essays, their stories crop up in my fiction. So like I have a novel that's going to be coming out in like the next year or so, and it's about a teenager, but the stories of the comfort women have cropped up into the narrative, and they're a big part of the background of that novel, as well as my trying to do the nonfiction. So I just feel like, you know, in part it's sort of intuitive, and you never know what you have to say, you never know what you're going to make up, but you just give yourself the freedom to do it, and it's you learn the tools of craft, character, plot, you know, things like that, and then you use them to hone what your intuition has to say, you know, because writing isn't like it isn't a science. You know, it's not, there's no formula. Part of what makes work distinguishable is the part that's like the gift. And, you know, yes, some people have the gift, you know, and that's what you want to nurture, and you want to use the tools then to support that gift.
Right. Okay. Great.
Okay, well, it seems like we've covered the questions in the chat room, so thank you so much. This has been wonderful.
You're welcome.
Wonderful.
I hope it was helpful. I wish I could see all your faces, because their faces are awesome.
All right, well, if you have any other questions, feel free to contact us, and we can always get in touch with Evelina again. And again, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it. All right. Have a great afternoon. Thanks again.